Well, hello.
I don't think there's ever an episode that we've started that I've not been chewing as you put the camera on.
It's true. It's true. Well, that's
I
all
made
right.
a, I made a mistake, and I'm going to fess up to it.
Come
Okay.
on.
While we were shopping the other day, I had a mad minute, and I said to Josie, "I'm going to get some olives," and she was like, "Shut up! You don't shut up. You don't
Shut
like
up.
olives." And I was like, "No, they're all right. They're okay. Don't worry. I'll have the olives." Got the olives. We'd had some sort of like meat platter, like dried cure ham. We had a nice rosemary and salt focaccia, that sort of thing. I had a few olives.
Was it a
Fucking
bit of
disgusting.
a charcuterie board?
Charcoal today, man. Yeah, I don't know why I'm sounding Indian. Um, accents are not my forte. Um, anyways, had a few of the olives, but there's still a whole pot of them left. And Josie went yesterday, she was like, "Shall I just throw these away? You're not going to eat them." And I was like, "No, I am. I am going to eat them." She was like,
Oh, I
"You're
love them.
not. You're not going to eat them." And I was like, I will eat them like a child. I was like, "I promise I will eat them." She was like, "You're just going to eat them now just to spite me, aren't you? Because I've said you're not going to eat them." And I was like, "No, I do love olives. I
So
really
I've
like them."
always loved olives. I
So
actually do properly love olives. So
I
I'll
know
be
you do.
I'll
And I
be
wanted to,
fuming if you've thrown them away.
well, I wanted to be that person because for my lunch today, I done myself some dried like cured ham things.
Mm.
I had a lump of Stilton. I had some olives. I had a bit of mackerel. I had a real nice like selection of picky bits on my plate for lunch. Oh, I fucking hate the olives. Oh my god, they're just so disgusting.
Oh, I love olives.
I
Oh,
can't.
they're
I've tried
so
them.
good.
They say try something about 10 times and you'll like them. I can't.
That
I'm
worked.
having
That
to.
worked for Claire's mum.
No, I've eaten loads, but I'm having to eat them with other things in my mouth because I just can't even bear it. And then I'm like, oh, that's made that taste awful now. So I'm gonna have to get rid of them,
What sort of olives are they?
the green ones, because the black ones, bleh.
I
I've
love
always
all
said
all olives. I just love them. I could eat them all day, every day. I love
no,
olives.
the black ones. I remember when I was in primary school. This is how much it's haunted me. We had
Mhm.
like this Greek tasting day, and we got to taste different Greek foods.
I
And I
was going to say,
tasted.
what sort of school did you go to? Where you? I remember one day at school we had
We
olives
had olives.
with lunch
Yes.
with our
No,
martinis.
when you dress up like a Roman, that sort of thing. It was
Yeah.
like a Greek day, and I tried a black olive. And as a child, I went, "That's what dragon meat would taste like."
Okay.
That if there was dragons and we ate the meat, that's exactly what it would taste like.
That
And
is
since
so
then, I can't eat a
random.
black olive. Yeah, dragon meat.
Honestly, your brain goes to these places where you're like, if dragons were a thing and we slayed the dragons for their meat and then ate the meat from those dragons, this is what it tastes like. But yet, when
Black
I
olive.
suggest that someone's seen a flipping ghost,
A ghost train.
you're like, nah,
Give me
nah,
dragons any day.
that's way too far fetched.
No, dragons, 100%. If we can have dinosaurs roaming the earth,
Well,
why could we not have
we
had a
did.
dragon?
Yeah,
Exactly.
I believe in dragons. I
There you
believe.
go.
Yeah, but also, I'll tell you something else I believe in.
Go on, tell me.
Mothman.
Oh, yeah. Ah, Mothman t-shirt.
And have you seen my sign?
Have seen your sign. I can very blurrily see it in the background there.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to see. It says Mothman is real and he is my boyfriend.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Woohoo! Mothman. Yeah, I love that.
Do you know what else is real? Random blams. Go.
So bananas are radioactive.
Yeah.
I've got an allergy to bananas, so I am not radioactive. But it
I don't
says
like nanas. Bleh.
no,
Nanas on or anything.
we're not a podcast that enjoys a
Nanas.
nana. No,
No.
don't like it. But it says due to being rich in potassium, every banana is actually slightly radioactive, thanks to the containing natural isotope potassium 40. or potassium minus 4. I don't know.
We're
Interestingly,
not scientists.
We don't know. We're professionals. We're not scientists. Interestingly, your body contains around 16 milligrams of potassium 40, meaning that around 280 times more radioactive than a banana already. So if you are someone that eats a lot of bananas, then you are more radioactive than most people.
Radioactive.
That'd be interesting to see if like people with certain illnesses and how that connects to like people that eat a lot of like nanas.
Babes.
I don't know if the radioactiveness would kill stuff off. I
don't know. Radiation by nature is not very good for you. So
it's not, is it?
Although it kills off cancer cells.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder how many bananas you'd have to eat to be so radioactive that cancer's like, nah.
But don't people exposed to radiation get cancer? Because when I was when I was having my radiation treatment, they said there's a risk of giving me lung cancer and skin cancer.
God's sake.
But get rid of my other cancer. Honestly.
It's a lottery, this life.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, my random blam is something that I thought of the other day, and it's about our little podcast. And I thought, God, we've got like 11. This will be 112 maybe episodes.
I think it's more than that. I think we're on 114.
Are we? So if you listened to one episode a day, which is quite long, I generally don't listen to one episode a day. If I start listening to a podcast, I do some driving, but if the podcast's an hour long, I'm not driving for an hour every day. So I'll listen to it. Maybe it take me 2 days. But if you listen to one episode every day, it would take you 3.5 months to listen to every episode. That's quite long.
It's quite long. That is quite long. And it won't be long before we're on episode 365. So if you listened to one episode every day, it would take you a whole year.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Real crazy.
Cray.
So yeah, random blams.
Yeah.
Done. They're done.
Done. Done. Done. Done. Done.
Dun dun dun.
Dun dun dun.
Shout out. Yeah. You opened your mouth to say something, and I was like, you got in there first.
Cut me right down.
So we've got some new blammers to our Blamily that we're going to do a shout out to. We're shouting out to Celeste.
Hey Celeste.
Hey Celeste.
Hey Celeste.
Newest blammers. Thank you very much for joining our little Blamily.
Thanks, Celeste.
And we're going to shout out to Lisa. Now, I think we did give Lisa a shout out for being a blam, a blamler. And
I think we've got 2 Lisas now.
Well, but anybody who's named Lisa, shout out to Lisa. But Lisa sent us. Hey, Lisa. Lisa sent us a lovely, lovely message the other day, all the way from Australia, I believe.
You thought about doing the accent then, didn't you?
Oh,
I could see it in your lips. You quivered, and you were like, all the way from Australia.
Not going to butcher it. And she was so lovely about our little podcast. And she said how much she enjoys the fact that it really made me laugh. She was like, I love that you don't claim to know everything. I was like, I know nothing.
Or much. Yeah, much at all, really.
No, bunch of dickheads here. We know nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like some podcasts, when you listen to them, they just reel off all these facts and things like that. And I think, I don't know what that. Am I supposed to know what that is?
Yeah.
And they're just talking like they know what these things are, and I'm like, it makes me feel real stupid because I don't know what that is.
I don't know what it is.
No, I'll always hold my hand up. Didn't know what that was. Did some research. Every day's a school day. We're all learning. And she said that she likes that we respect each other's viewpoints. You know, we've got 2 different viewpoints on things, and we respect that, and everybody else's viewpoints as well. Because while I sit here and say I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in this, other people do, and I try to be as respectful as I can. You do. I know. And I know that people have their own beliefs, and I love that, because I would love to believe in ghosts. I just don't understand it. That's
Yeah.
why we do this.
Well, that's why we're constantly perplexed by
Yeah.
so many different things, which is where all our episodes have come from.
Yeah. And also she brought to our attention something which we said from the start, guys, we're gonna get it wrong. Because we don't know everything.
Don't know nothing, mate.
Despite the fact that we are professionals, we will get it wrong. And Lisa brought to our attention the fact that we often say committed suicide.
Yeah.
Which is incorrect. And so henceforth we shall say died by suicide or took their own life, things like that, instead of committed suicide, because it, we say, like Kate said the other day, we say they committed a crime, or they committed murder, and it makes it sound like they've done something illegal or they've committed some sort of crime.
Yeah, they've done some sort of heinous act.
Yeah. But I said thank you for putting that to us so politely, instead of coming at us and being like, don't say this, you've offended all these people. Because I didn't know, but now that you've mentioned it, that makes perfect sense. So
yeah, it's someone pointing something out that actually made both me and Sarah go, oh yeah.
Oh, actually, yeah.
Actually, I've never stopped to consider that, but
yeah. I never thought about it in that respect.
No, and she brought it to us with love.
So thank you. We love that.
We respond to that so much better, and I really appreciate it, Lisa. And that's a really bloody good point.
Yeah. Yep. So thank you very much.
Cheers for that. And also, Lisa asked about where I was from, because my voice was perplexing. You haven't heard
your voice sounded like a.
You ain't heard all my voices. You ain't heard all my voices. What? Yeah, exactly. So
no, Essex born and bred.
Essex born and bred. I did look up the area that you said that was it her aunt?
Yeah, for the rest of her family live,
yeah. I'm sure it's a beautiful area of the country. I have
not nearby though.
I ain't got no relation to that area. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm common as muck from Essex. My family all originate from London. So yeah, that is where I is from.
Excellent. Well, so shout out to Duns. Thank you very much to everybody.
Oh, can I just do one other shout out?
Absolutely.
This is a shout out to my sister Tess. It is her birthday today.
Her birthday.
It's her birthday today. I love you so much, Pug, and I can't wait for us to be back together. She lives in France and I do not. I live in the UK. But we'll be reunited soon and can't wait to see you. When this episode airs, it will be Tuesday. So her birthday will have been yesterday. So happy birthday for yesterday.
There you go.
There you go.
That is how short notice we record.
Yeah. Literally sometimes the evening before, and we're like,
sometimes, yeah.
Again.
Yes.
Yeah.
But shall we crack on, because this is a whopper.
All right. Well, shout outs done. Episode not done. All right, let's go. Morning.
Wow. Okay.
I'm very conscious that I can be too loud.
That was just so delicate.
Well, our microphones are actually part of this podcast as well, and they have their own personalities. And a lot of the time, when we shriek down the microphone, it just cuts us out altogether. It's just like,
hell, love.
Stop shouting in my face. I'm not even putting that in the pod. And we don't realise until we're doing production. And then we're like, oh, did you realise I just said production? I was so professional.
Your microphone's cut that out because it's got fucking production. But they ain't kidding.
Who do you think you are? Yeah, I know. But yeah, so our microphones will cut us out. So I thought I'd do a delicate morning.
Yeah, really,
and
really
then come in with a morning.
Morning.
Well,
right, so this is my episode, okay?
The title of this episode is Creepy as you like.
I debated so much over what to call this episode.
Call blimey,
So,
governor.
call blimey. So, yeah, and it's taken me 3 weeks so far to do the research, and this is going to be 2 parts plus a BLAM.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a
Plus
big one.
a BLAM.
2 parts plus a BLAM.
What's the BLAM bit going to be connected to?
The BLAM is a back history of the perpetrator. I didn't want. I physically can't put all the information in here. It's going to be far too long, and I don't like saying to people, "Oh, if you want to listen to the rest of the story, you've got to subscribe to us." Blah blah blah, because that's nonsense. I don't like doing that.
But you do.
No. So I will tell you the episode. I will tell you the story as it is, and then if you want to know the background information of said person, Gary Heidnik, then that will be the BLAM. But it's not.
That'll be our blackmail part.
It's not the pertinent to the story.
Right.
But it is interesting, so subscribe.
Well, I'll be there. I don't know about you lot, but I'll be there.
Yeah. So I'm a bit nervous about this one because I really want to do it well, but I started reading non-fiction books when I was probably about, I don't know, 11 or 12. Just books of child abuse, stories about serial killers, stories like Joseph Fritzl and Jason Dugard, and you name it, I've read it, and I've probably still got the book as well because I just keep them. I read it, keep them.
Yeah, no, I do. I've got a couple of books that I read. Do you remember what your first true crime or non-fiction? Do you remember what the first one that you read?
They were the Dave Pelzer books.
So yeah, that was mine. When I read Child Called It, I was like, whoa.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I started reading everything I could get my hands on that related to that sort of topic because it just it perplexed me from that age. I just couldn't believe. And as morbid as it is, why are we reading stories about child abuse? Why is that an interesting read? But you do, don't you? I don't know why.
Yeah.
It's so perplexing that these things happen and that people can do that and act that way.
It's trying to, your brain trying to understand human nature, I think.
Yeah.
And why do we do these things? Why do we feel the need to do these things?
Well, this is a perfect episode for this because this case that I'm covering today, I hadn't heard about, and I don't know why, because it's something that I thought would have been more prominent. Maybe it is in America. It's just not over here, and I didn't know it. And it really, really shook me to my core because once you strip it all back, strip everything back, it asks you, what lengths would you go to in order to survive?
Ooh.
And this is a story that will affect a lot of our listeners. It covers topics of every nature, you name it. And so listener discretion is...
Well, you turned into one of the crays and all.
Discretion. Listener discretion is advised.
Okie dokie.
Here we go. Josefina Rivera was a 25-year-old Hispanic woman living in Philadelphia in 1986. Her early life started out rough. At about 6 weeks old, her and her siblings were taken into Child Protective Services after being found abandoned. They were just left, basically, and they weren't found for a couple of days, so they weren't in great condition. At 4 months old, she was, however, adopted by what she said was an amazing family. And this is now her mum, and she was an amazing woman. She taught her everything that she needed to know, and she had everything that she could ever want and need. And she was a smart kid. She did well in school. But because she was so smart, and we often see this, she would get bored very easily. So she needed something to occupy her attention. And in an area of Philadelphia that was riddled with crime and poverty, it's no surprise that Josefina took to the same habits that gripped most of its residents: drugs. By age 13, she was smoking weed, and by age 14, get bored of the mediocre high that weed gave, she was taking crack. An expensive habit for a 14-year-old. So she started dealing it, buying bags for $10 and then selling them to $25, or when the demand was higher, selling them for $50. By age 17, she had foregone her dreams of a lucrative career and was dancing in a go-go bar, where she was quite often propositioned for sex. She soon realised that 5 minutes of her time was worth a few $100s. And most of the girls working in the club were street workers, sex workers on the side, so why not her? By age 19, she'd become pregnant with her first child. And this was actually what she needed to kind of break away from the sex work and break away from the drugs and things like that. And she tried to get herself back on the straight and narrow. She moved back home with her mum after ending the relationship with her daughter's father, and she started studying business. She then met and married a man in the hopes that perhaps married life would settle her restlessness. But it didn't. She got bored very easily. She was just constantly needing something. And after the birth of her second child, she was divorced and in an abusive relationship and heavily dependent on crack, needing a hit in the morning just to get out of bed. Both of her children were removed from her custody. The first was taken to live with her father, and the second went into Child Protective Services. And when little Ronnie was born with drugs in his system, she knew that he too would be taken away from her. And it was at the hospital, while she held his premature little hand, looking at all the tubes coming out of him, his tiny little body, that she vowed she would get clean and she was going to get her kids back. Her social worker said that she needed to get a place of her own, somewhere for her kids to be returned to. She needed to get clean and she needed to stop working the streets. So Josefina had a plan. She would continue working the streets until she had enough money for a place of her own and for her kids, and then she would get clean. It was November 26th, the day before Thanksgiving. She'd just had a huge fight with her current boyfriend and left the flat in a hurry, slamming the door closed behind her. She needed to earn some money to see her through the holidays. The only problem was there wasn't really that many people out looking for sex workers on the eve of Thanksgiving. It was freezing outside and she was eager to be picked up, just to get out of the cold, really. So when she saw a car drive by, slowly, sort of like gauging her and seeing who she was, she saw it drive by, it then turned around. So she was hopeful that it was coming back for her. A tan Cadillac cruised to a stop beside her. An expensive car that you certainly didn't see in a neighbourhood like hers. The man inside asked if she was working. He was a white man with a plain face, long wavy brown hair and a thick beard. Just a regular guy. A guy that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. But it was his eyes that stood out for Josefina. They were piercingly blue, but translucent, as if there was nothing behind them. But Josefina wasn't deterred. She'd come across all sorts of people, despite her young age, and she just always stuck to one golden rule, that to keep herself safe. And her golden rule was that she would never go home with a man. So she slid into the passenger seat of the car and asked what he wanted. The man said that he wanted to do things with her, but he was 6 foot tall. So there wasn't really much room in the car. It wasn't something they were able to do. So would she mind coming back to his house? And seeing her hesitate, he added that he would pay her $50. So she'd been lucky enough so far to never get herself into any trouble with her clients. And perhaps this is why she decided to break her one and only rule. She agreed and gave her name as Nicole, a name that she always gave to her clients. She said that she couldn't be long because she had a babysitter at home with her kids. And this kind of piqued his interest a little bit. And he began asking her about her children, asking if she could still have children, asking if she'd had her tubes tied.
Goodness.
Just, yeah, a little bit in depth about her children. So she then asked for her new client's name. And together they drove the 15 minutes back to Gary Heidnik's house. It struck Josefina odd that someone driving such an expensive car lived in such a rough neighborhood. But again, she was no novice to rough areas. She thought that perhaps this was there's nothing to this, was just where we lived. They pulled up at Gary's house and walked to the front door, past an entire front yard's worth of random debris. And Gary took out his key. And Josefina noticed that it was cut in half. And when I first heard that, for whatever reason, my brain thought that it was cut in half so that it was like
lengthways.
Down the centre lengthways. And I don't know why. And I was thinking, what? But it was cut so that the tip of it was off and it was just a much shorter key.
Like he'd broken his key off or something.
Like he'd broken his key off, yeah. And she mentioned this to Gary, and he said that he'd just decided to cut it in half and leave the other half in the door. That way, no one could ever pick the lock. She thought, it's a rough neighbourhood. That, great idea. So as they entered Gary's house, she saw straight away the windows throughout the house had thick iron bars on the inside. Not unusual for a rough neighbourhood. She noticed a vast amount of pornography stacked in the corner of his front room. And again, she was there for sex, really. So it didn't really make the hairs on the neck stand up or anything. And they made their way down the hallway. She noticed that the walls were lined with coins. Like, instead of wallpaper, dimes, cents, quarters, all covering the walls from top to bottom.
Oh.
And going up the stairs to the bedroom, the coins gave way to dollars. And every now and then, Josefina spotted a $10 bill or a $20 bill. And she thought to herself, wouldn't it be nice to have so much money that you could decorate your house with it? So Gary led Josefina up into the bedroom. He handed her the $50 as promised. She undressed and conducted her business.
Scusties.
When all was done and over, she started putting her clothes back on when she felt something close tightly around her neck from behind. It took a moment for her brain to process the information. Why couldn't she breathe? What were those black spots starting to appear in her vision? What was this terror that she had just begun to feel? Gary Heidnik had wrapped his arm around her throat and was choking her from behind. So when the brain fog lifted and she realised her life was in danger, she began to fight. She struggled against his arm. She bucked. She desperately tried to throw him off and loosen the grip that he had on her throat. She remembers him saying, "If you stop fighting, I'll stop choking you." And she immediately complied. The grip slackened and she inhaled a big lungful of air. And as she did this, Gary wrenched her right arm behind her back, and she felt the cold metal of something slide on her wrist and then heard it snap shut. Gary told her to give him the other arm so that he could slip the other handcuff on. Naked, with her hands handcuffed behind her back, Gary led Josefina down the stairs, past the coin-lined wallpapered walls, through the kitchen and to a door that exposed harsh cement steps leading to the basement. He pushed her roughly down the stairs. A single bulb illuminated the dank pit that she now found herself in. And she looked around frantically, assessing the situation. A radio was playing incredibly loudly, distorting her senses. It sat atop a large freezer, a pinball machine, some sandbags filled with dirt, and there, in the centre of the room, a pit dug right into the ground. Panicked and gripped with fear, was this to be her grave? Was he going to kill her right there and then and bury her in that shallow pit? As she stood there contemplating her death, Gary began attaching metal muffler clamps to each of her ankles, the type that you would use to attach your exhaust to the underside of the car. He attached a short chain to each muffler clamp, making it impossible for her to open her legs very wide. She looked almost like a prison inmate. As if this wasn't restriction enough, Gary then took another longer chain, attached it to one ankle, and then padlocked it to a metal pipe in the basement. He worked methodically, routinely, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. He finished the job by applying glue over the top of the screws holding the muffler clamps on, and then used a hairdryer to dry it, ensuring that she absolutely could not escape.
Jeez.
Feet bound and chained, Gary unlocked the handcuffs holding Josefina's hands behind her back and then pushed her roughly into the pit. She was by no means a big woman. Even at 5'7", she didn't fit properly in the hole. Her knees were crammed tightly against her chest, her arms pinned to her sides. All of this happened in such a blur that she couldn't make sense of anything. She hadn't even cried out for help at this point. It wasn't until something large and solid was being pulled across the opening of the pit did she really start to begin to panic. She tried to wiggle around to free her arms, to stop Gary from sealing her into the pit. He reached down into the pit and began beating her before fully enclosing her in.
Ugh.
The pit, however, was too small for her, and her head stopped the board from sitting flush with the floor, so there was like a little bit of a gap. So Gary weighed it down. He grabbed a few of the heavy bags of dirt and placed them on top of the board. So she was now completely trapped in the pit. Her situation fully hit her now. Stuffed in this dark, dank, musty pit, shackled, chained, claustrophobic, she began to scream. A scream that came from the depth of her being, and she hated the sound of it coming out of her. Hated how scared and panicked she sounded. But what else could she do? She screamed and yelled for help, getting drowned out by the loud music playing above her. There was no chance anyone would hear her, and she eventually fell asleep. She woke to the sound of a man's voice. Groggy and not fully awake, she tried to tune her ears to the voice. It was the radio host, wishing everyone a happy Thanksgiving, asking each of his listeners what they had to be thankful for. She would have laughed at the irony had she had room for her lungs to expand properly. Her arms and legs burned from being packed in so tightly, and she didn't know how much longer she remained down in the pit. But she did. Josefina was down in that pit for 28 hours before she felt the vibrations of footsteps coming down the basement steps. So this renewed her energy a small bit, and she began screaming and yelling. She could hear Gary above her removing the dirt bags from the board, and soon the board was lifted, and immediately she felt this sharp pain of this immense beating. Gary had brought down a metal pole and was beating Josefina while she was in the pit, unable to even move an inch to get out of the way of the attack. As soon as it began, it was over. The board was placed back on top and Gary was gone. But only for a short while this time. Half an hour later, he was back. He pulled Josefina out the pit by her ponytail and forced her onto a blow-up mattress he'd just brought down. There he raped her. Too tired to put up a fight, she didn't even try. Once he was done, he laid down beside her, resting his head on her stomach, and fell asleep. How long he was asleep for, she didn't know. But as soon as he opened his eyes, he jumped up, grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the wall, and started digging into the pit. As he dug, he spoke to Josefina. He offered her a glimpse into his life and a horrifying glimpse into her future. He told Josefina about his time in the army, how he was a trained nurse but was discharged with full disability pay after being diagnosed with a mental illness. He said that he'd been married briefly and that his wife had become pregnant and left him, and he was unable to see his child. He told Josefina that he'd also had a child with a previous relationship, but it had also been taken into protective custody because the mother was intellectually disabled and he was a diagnosed schizophrenic. He openly admitted that he rarely took his medication, and he started to complain about CPS and how they'd so far taken 4 of his children away from him. So now he'd had to come up with a new plan. so that no one could take his children away from him. He told Josefina that he'd always dreamed of having a big family and being together in the house. So that was what he was going to get. His plan was to capture 10 women and impregnate them all, keeping them all locked up in his house. That was the only way he was going to be able to get his dream. This revelation stunned Josefina. He had just informed her that he was in fact an unmedicated madman, and this made him all the more dangerous. But instead of showing fear, she just listened to him talk and ran as he widened the pit. He told her how he liked black women, but he preferred them dumb, as he called it. That way, they were easier to control. So as Josefina listened, he turned to her and said, "I think I made a mistake with you. You aren't stupid." And with that, he put down the shovel and went back upstairs. He left Josefina out of the pit and unhandcuffed. That night, out of the confines of the pit, Josefina prayed and prayed, thinking that that was the only way she was going to be able to escape, if God answered her prayers. The next morning, Josefina woke, naked, freezing, and stiff on the basement floor. Somewhere above her, she felt the vibrations of Gary's car suddenly start up, and then felt it leave. She decided she needed to do something. What if he changed his mind about wanting this big family and just decided to kill her? So she decided to inspect the basement. The chain was long enough for her to move freely around the room. And at the far end of the basement was a small little grate built into the wall at head height. And she felt a breeze coming through it, so she knew it led to outside. She squatted down on the floor and began to try and free her ankles. On one, the glue covering the screws was completely impenetrable. There was no hope she was going to be able to pick that off. But on the other ankle, there was a little bit of hope. She began sliding her nail underneath the glue and picking it off bit by bit until the screw was visible. She was then able to unscrew it with her nail and release one ankle. That was enough for her to be able to stretch her legs far enough apart to be able to climb up to that grate. Still attached, though, via a long chain to the sewer pipe on the opposite wall. Having not eaten for 2 days, her strength was almost non-existent, yet she managed to push out the grate and wiggle half of her body out until there was no more room in the chain. The fresh air hit her face and it breathed into her this new life, and she began screaming and shouting and hollering at the top of her lungs, "Help! Help! Please help me! This guy's got me chained up in his basement. He's raping me. Please call the police." So she was out in Gary's back garden with gardens and houses to the other side. Someone must have been able to hear her. So she changed tactic and she decided to shout in Spanish, repeating a variation of what she had just previously shouted, but still she got no response. And then she saw a large metal rod lying on the ground in arm's reach. She grabbed it and began striking the metal chain link fence separating Gary's garden from the neighbours, screaming like a crazy banshee and using what little energy she had. She beat that fence until it started to fall down. Yeah, and finally, she heard it. Footsteps getting closer and closer. So she continued screaming and hollering and banging when she felt an excruciating pain in one of her legs, as if it had just been wrenched from its socket. Jeez. She glanced backwards into the basement and her heart dropped. There stood Gary Heidnik with her chain in his hand. He had tugged on it so hard, it had pulled her back inside. But she clung on to this frame as hard as she could, using her free leg to kind of wedge her foot into the frame. So she was kind of like wedged in place. But Gary continued to tug on her chain, but he didn't get anywhere. She was firmly in place. The next thing she knew, Gary was in front of her, out in the garden, trying to push her back inside with his foot. but she was just so wedged in, she was holding strong. After only a few minutes, he gave up and disappeared until she felt the most horrendous pain in her leg again. He was back inside and yanking on this chain, not just pulling it, but short, sharp tugs. She was sure that he would break her leg or dislocate them. And then she would have no chance of escaping. So she thought, I'm going to have to release. So she eventually released this death grip that she had on the frame, and she slumped back inside the basement. Gary immediately set to work and put the muffler clamps back on her other leg, popped the glue back on, and making sure that there was extra glue on there so that she could never get out again. While he worked, he explained to Josefina that the reason no one came to her rescue wasn't because they didn't hear her. It was because he paid them to mind their own business. His neighbourhood was mostly drug dealers, and if they wanted to keep dealing, that he would turn a blind eye to whatever went on in their house, so they had better turn a blind eye to whatever went on in his house.
Goodness.
So he beat Josefina with the handle of his shovel and promised her that if she ever tried anything like that again, he would kill her. He re-handcuffed her hands behind her back and left her, bloody, bruised, and hopeless on the cement basement floor. She must have drifted off to sleep at some point, despite the ache in her arms, the burning of her sores, and the heaviness in her heart, because she was woken up sometime later when Gary re-entered the basement. He'd brought with him 2 slices of bread and a sip of water, her first taste of anything since being kidnapped. She ate every morsel as slowly as she could, and while she ate, Gary continued to work down in the pit, making it large enough to fit the blow-up mattress. Before throwing her down into the pit for the night, he raped her, never saying a word. It was now her second night down in the pit. For having the double mattress with her didn't ease her dismay. While she waited for sleep to come, the realisation that literally no one knew where she was hit her hard. There was no way she was going to be rescued. She had come in through the front door, and she knew that that was the only way she was going to be able to leave. She fell asleep thinking of the impossibility of such a task. The sound that woke her up the next day was of crying. A woman crying. And it took her a second to realise that it wasn't coming from her. Then she heard Gary shouting, "Shut up, Sandra. You know me. You know I'm not going to hurt you. Why are you crying?" The sound was getting closer, the crying louder, until it was right on top of her. Gary removed the sandbags and board covering the pit and lifted Josefina painfully out by the ponytail. Stood with Gary, a woman, black, naked, crying, hands cuffed behind her back. "Sandra, Nicole, Sandra." He introduced the women like they were meeting for the first time at a dinner party.
Yeah. God.
And remember that Josefina had told Gary that her name was Nicole. So that is how she's referred to while she's down in the basement. Josefina watched in shock as Gary went about the same methodical routine, attaching the muffler clamps, covering the bolts in glue, attaching the chains, and then padlocking it to the same pipe that Josefina was attached to. He put both women down in the pit, replaced the board and the sandbags, and went upstairs, leaving the 2 women to get acquainted. Sandra was 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay. She'd met Gary a few years prior and were, by her standards, good friends. She told Josefina that they had met at the Elwyn Institute, a place for mentally and intellectually disabled people. Sandra had the mental capacity of a teenager, and Gary had won her over with his charm. He often took her out for lunch and then would bring her back to his house, where he had legally started a church, and he called himself Bishop Gary. The church was the United Church of the Ministers of God, and it was held in Gary's front room every week. He would hold sermons for the intellectually disabled, and people liked his church. They felt that Gary understood them and that he never asked for donations. He never asked for money in any way, shape or form. And that was something that a lot of them didn't have. So they felt appreciated at Gary's church. She also explained that Gary had once impregnated her, but she'd decided to abort the pregnancy, which had infuriated Gary. He had offered her $4,000 for her to have his baby, but she'd declined. And she couldn't understand why Gary was doing this to her. You know, her good friend. What did he want from her? So Josefina told her of Gary's plan. And she immediately felt protective of Sandra, because it was quite obvious to her that she had this mental, the intellect of a young teenager, and she couldn't fully comprehend the situation that she was in.
Yeah.
So Josefina promised her that she would find a way to get them out. She really did mother her. And Sandra provided Josefina with an insight into Gary's mind. He wasn't just this madman intent on having lots and lots of babies. He did have a human side, and perhaps that would be her way out. The two women settled into a new normal down in the basement. Every morning, Gary would bring them bread and water, rape them, and continue digging out the pit. He brought the women a battery-operated TV to occupy them while they were down in the pit, but they soon realised that it actually ate up what little oxygen they had down in the pit if they left it running too long. The batteries only lasted 2 hours, so they had to ration this 2 hours throughout the day. And together, they bonded, and they tried to come up with different plans of escape, none of which were ever feasible, but they tried their best to keep up each other's spirits as best they could. A few days after Sandra arrived, while watching Gary dig out the pit, through the blaring music, Josefina felt, more than heard, a relentless pounding coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone was trying to knock the front door down. But Gary didn't bat an eyelid. He continued right on digging, knowing that no one was going to be able to come through that front door unless it was blown off. But whoever it was wasn't giving up. And eventually Gary put the women back in the hole, put the board on top, put the sandbags on top, and he went upstairs. There was no way they could hear voices through the blaring of the radio, but that didn't stop them trying. Down in the pit, away from most of the noise, they were able to feel the vibrations of movement throughout the house, and they felt Gary's heavy footsteps coming back down into the basement 5 minutes later. He pulled the women out of the pit and continued digging, explaining that it was just one of his neighbours knocking at the front door. The next evening, though, Gary came down wearing leather gloves, carrying a blank piece of paper, a pen, and an envelope. He ordered Sandra to write something and instructed her to write, "Dear Mum, I am fine. I am in New York and I'll get in touch with you soon. Don't worry. Love, Sandra." He made her write her mother's name and address on the front of the envelope and asked her to handle both, ensuring that her fingerprints would be all over it. It became very apparent to Josefina that it wasn't Gary's neighbour that had been knocking furiously yesterday. It had been Sandra's family, and this was Gary's way of throwing them off the scent. He gave the women 2 slices of bread, put them back in the hole, and left. Josefina could tell that he had gotten in his car and driven away. But as time went on, Josefina began to panic that she hadn't heard Gary's car return. So these new fears now started to take over. What if he'd been in an accident? No one knew where they were. They would either starve to death or asphyxiate. The longer time went on, the more she actually began to pray for Gary's return. He hadn't really been awful to them. You know, he only beat them if they didn't comply. He'd given them tea, coffee, sugar, like a little station set up in the basement. He'd given them a TV. He hadn't really treated them that badly.
Jeez.
She began to miss Gary's frequent visits to the basement and was relieved when she eventually heard his car pull back into the drive. He'd been gone 24 hours. When he came down into the basement, Josefina was ecstatic. And when she was pulled free of the pit, her words just came tumbling out. "Thank God you're back." She was practically hugging him. "I'm so relieved you're here. I'm so happy you're back. I was so worried you'd been in an accident. And then we heard your car pull up." And as these words tumbled out, Gary's face started to change. What do you mean you heard my car? It was then that Josefina realised the loud music wasn't just so that they couldn't be heard screaming. It was also there so that they didn't know what Gary was doing. He went upstairs, leaving the women wondering what was going on. Had he been gone so long because he was getting another girl? Had he just gone back upstairs to bring her down? When he emerged in the basement again a little later, he wasn't holding a new girl. Instead, in his hand, he had a screwdriver.
Oh my God.
He grabbed Sandra first. Throwing her to the ground, he straddled her, pinning her in place with his legs, turning her on her side so one ear was resting on the ground and the other towards Gary.
Oh God, please don't.
Warning Sandra not to move, he took his screwdriver and rammed it into her ear.
Oh.
Too stunned and terrified to do anything, Josefina watched in horror, knowing that it would be her turn next. As soon as blood erupted from Sandra's ear, Gary seemed satisfied that he'd done his job. He turned her over, bloody ear to the ground, and began again. He told the women that he knew just how much pressure to apply to deaden the eardrum and not rupture it, but they had to remain still. Once he was finished with Sandra, he'd done the same with Josefina, only satisfied when both ears were pouring with blood. Task completed, both women curled up together, sobbing, and Gary told them that they'd better keep that clean and not let it get infected. Ain't no one going to the hospital, that's a fact, he said. And then he left. The days turned into weeks, the same hellish routine of bread and water, rapings, beatings when Gary felt the girls weren't pleasing him enough. Josefina realised if she was super compliant, Gary didn't beat her quite as often. So she started trying to warm him. She started to compliment him on his hair, on his clothes. And he liked this. She could see a sort of smile on his face whenever she paid him this sort of attention. After nearly a month of being held in the basement, Gary asked Josefina when her period was due. "What's the date?" she asked. 20th of December. Her heart sank. Her period was late.
Oh.
Gary was overjoyed. 2 days later, Lisa arrived. Naked, crying, and handcuffed, he introduced the newest member of the basement to its current residents. Once he was finished chaining her up, he put her in the hole and left. Josefina and Sandra spent a lot of their time now out of the pit, and as soon as they were sure Gary was out of earshot, they spoke to Lisa, trying to calm her down, telling her that she would be okay, telling her he doesn't want to kill them, he just wants to, keep them chained up to have babies and things, so, don't worry too much. Josefina found out that Lisa was 19. She'd been picked up by Gary on her way to a friend's house. She'd seen his expensive Cadillac and had waved. And this prompted him to pull over and offer her a ride to wherever she was going, which she gratefully accepted. She thought, if I show up to my friend's house in this really expensive Cadillac, she's going to be like really envious. So she was super happy to get into Gary's car. Like, she was over the moon. And she got to her friend's house. She'd left like a glove there or something. So she picked up the glove. She showed off this man and the expensive car that they were getting in together. And off they went. And as they drove together, Gary offered to take her out for dinner. As they ate, he asked Lisa if she wanted to come to Atlantic City with him the following day. And she was a bit wary, but only because she said she didn't have any nice clothes to wear to such a nice place. But Gary said, "Don't worry, I will take you clothes shopping." He spent $50 on her, bought her all the clothes that she wanted, and then asked if she wanted to try them on at his house. They get back to the house. At some point, she passes out. It was thought that she'd had what's Benadryl, like a
antihistamine.
Yeah. Yeah, it was thought that she'd had some sort of antihistamine earlier in the day, and then when she
Made
got
her
back to
sleepy.
Gary and she was drinking it, she passed out. I don't think that's the case, however. I think that he probably put something in her drink.
Yeah. I think that's far more likely.
Yeah, absolutely. And when she woke up to him on top of her, raping her. He then strangled her and handcuffed her, the same as he'd done to all the other women.
Jeez.
But it turns out that the pit wasn't big enough for the three women. So Gary let Josefina stay out, and then he'd put Sandra and Lisa in. And he started to favour Josefina. Whether it was because he suspected that she was pregnant or not, she didn't know. But the other women started to pick up on it. On Christmas, Gary decided to surprise the women. He came down to the basement with a Chinese menu in hand and allowed the girls to each pick one item. Until that point, they had literally only had bread and water. They had the occasional tea and coffee, but they had to ration it. So it was mostly just sugar and water that they would drink.
Right.
They would try and pack it with so much sugar so that they wasn't starving.
Blimey, that would have set them off for going to poopies.
I don't know.
Sugar water,
Yeah,
make them poopy.
maybe. So Josefina had been there the longest. So to say that she enjoyed this Chinese meal was an understatement. Their taste buds were completely renewed. You know, after this meal, that all of their spirits were lifted. What started out as a miserable Christmas day when the radio host wished everyone a Merry Christmas had actually turned out to be a decent day after all. December 31st brought Deborah. All three women in the basement heard the new arrival before they saw her. Unlike the other girls, Deborah didn't come into the basement crying. She was fighting. Despite being handcuffed, she did her best to fight Gary, screaming and shouting insults into his face. Yes, what the fuck do you think you're doing? She screamed as he set to work shackling her up. Are you deaf, you fucking freak? She just didn't give a shit. She was like all up in his
She was
face.
down fighting.
What the fuck do you think you're doing? And when he didn't respond to her, he just completely ignored her. She turned her attention to the three horrified women watching. What are you all looking at, you bitches? Do something. Attack him.
Yeah.
Like he had done with the other girls. Once he had finished attaching the chains, he tried to push Deborah down into the hole, but she was having absolutely none of it. She fought him with every ounce of energy that she had until he eventually picked up the shovel and beat her until she was too exhausted to fight any longer. And then he pushed her into the pit, quickly slid the board over and pushed the sandbags on top.
Jeez.
There wasn't a moment down in that pit that Deborah didn't stop screaming and shouting, despite the other girls telling her that no one could hear. Deborah was a fighter. She'd had a tough childhood and survived through sheer determination and fight. Unlike the other girls who complied with Gary's every demand, she did not. So Gary beat her often and hard. And the other girls were sometimes allowed out of the pit once they were compliant. That, you know, the pit was a bit of a punishment. So, but Deborah spent her whole time down in that pit, hollering and screaming. The girls repeatedly begged Deborah to just do as Gary wanted. Then that way she wouldn't get beat. But that just wasn't who Deborah was. And she often provoked Gary. He would come down in the basement and she'd be like, you fucking prick, who the fuck? He would just hurl these insults at him. And then he'd be like, oh, I have to beat her again now.
She's a troublesome one.
He was a troublesome one indeed. And Gary quickly tired of beating Deborah and not getting the control that he so desperately needed. So he decided to make the other women beat her. Often he would instruct Josefina to take the handle of the shovel and hit Deborah, telling her she needed to do it hard as Deborah had a, quote, arse-like leather. Josefina hated hitting the woman, but she did it. She did as she was instructed to do, ever compliant and obedient, so that she herself didn't receive a punishment.
Yeah.
When Gary would go upstairs, Deborah would shout at the other girls, "Why didn't you attack him? You had the shovel. There's 3 of you and 1 of him. You know, what are you doing? Do you enjoy it down here?"
I mean, she makes a good point.
It wasn't quite that simple, and Josefina knew it. She tried to tell the other girls that there would be no use in attacking Gary down in the basement because they were all chained to the pipe. If he didn't have the keys on him, then they would be trapped there, having killed their only chance of survival. So this carried on for the next 2 weeks. Daily beatings, rapes, Gary pitting the women against each other so that they didn't form a bond. He started creating a hierarchy against the 4 women, putting Josefina in charge of the other 3 women when he was out. She would have to report back to him any misdemeanors, and the girls would be punished accordingly. Because Josefina had a plan of her own. She knew the only way out of the basement was if Gary willingly let her out. So she decided to try and win Gary over. Do whatever she could in order to get on his good side and earn his trust. Entering into January, Sandra's period was now also late, and Gary was overjoyed at the prospect of having 2 children on the way. His plan was well underway, but he was still 6 women short. January 18th brought 18-year-old Jacqueline down into the basement. Gary brought her down, naked, handcuffed. She wasn't sobbing, she wasn't screaming, she was just silent, not truly comprehending the situation. Gary went through the same rigmarole of putting their clamps on. However, Jacqueline was so small and skinny that the muffler clamps were just far too big for her and her feet would just slip out. So in the end, he had to use handcuffs and he handcuffed her feet together. As he worked, he told the girls that he'd been out looking for a hooker. He stopped alongside a woman and rolled down his window to speak to her when Jacqueline came running up to him from the other side of the street. And she was like, "Don't pick her, pick me. You know, that other woman's got AIDS. You don't want her, you want me." So desperate was she for a client that she lied in order to be chosen by Gary. And he laughed in her face at the irony of the situation that Jacqueline had gotten herself into. He pushed her down into the pit, pushed the board on, put the sandbags on, still chuckling to himself, and he walked away. The following day, it was Josefina's birthday. Not something she'd expected to celebrate. Gary came down into the basement and presented the girls with a Chinese takeaway, much like he'd done on Christmas for Sandra and Josefina. He told them all that it was Josefina's birthday. He would allow them all to choose one dish. He also brought down a birthday cake. They all sang her a round of happy birthday. And he then presented her with a present. Not only was she shocked that he'd remembered her birthday, which she must have let slip out randomly in conversation, but he'd cared enough to get her a birthday cake and a present. When she opened it, she was shocked to see a pair of bright red fluffy slippers. She was so thankful to Gary that she gave him a hug. Until now, all of the girls were only wearing a t-shirt, nothing else. They spent all of their time practically naked on the cold cement floor, so the pair of slippers were a godsend. Gary then invited Josefina to have one dance with him in the basement, to a song that he had chosen. It seemed to Josefina that potentially her plan was working. She could feel that Gary wanted her attention. As they danced together, she could feel his eyes searching hers for some form of connection. But she didn't want to give it to him quite so readily. It was all part of her plan. A plan that made the other girls dislike her because it was clear to them that Josefina was fast becoming Gary's favourite. And she received a lot more favourable attention from him. But it was necessary in order to save herself and the other girls. She knew that it was her responsibility to get them all out alive. She was the oldest and the smartest of the women. What they saw as betrayal, she knew could well be the only way she could save them all. Despite all the plans of escape the other women discussed openly, Josefina never divulged her plan to anyone. So for the other 4 women that were trying to work together, It seemed to them that Josefina was almost working against them. She would tell tales on the girls for breaking rules when Gary was out, meaning that they would be punished. She would partake in the beating of Deborah when Gary asked her to, even though she would plead with Deborah to just behave so that she didn't keep receiving these beatings. Deborah just wouldn't. For every ounce of fight Deborah gave Gary, Josefina was completely, unwaveringly compliant, and neither one could understand the other. Often at loggerheads, because Josefina just wanted Deborah to be compliant, stop antagonizing him, just do as he says and you won't get beaten. I won't have to beat you. And Deborah was like, while you've got that stick in your hand, beat him over the head. That neither one could understand the other one.
Yeah.
It was now early February. Josefina had been down in the basement now for about 3.5 months, with Sandra following closely behind, and it was starting to take its toll. One morning, Sandra had started throwing up. What Gary took to be morning sickness, Josefina knew it was something else. Sandra was feverish, weak, hardly able to eat anything, and she wasn't looking well at all. When Gary came down to check her, he took her refusal to eat as defiance and beat her. Fearing for the health of his unborn baby, he tried to force feed Sandra some bread, ramming it into her mouth. But Sandra was unable to chew it and almost choked before she spat it out. Furious, as punishment, Gary decided he'd got this new torture thing that he'd made, and it was just a hook in the ceiling. Oh. And he would hang the girls' handcuffs, just one handcuff over it, and leave her there. The other girls all rallied around Sandra, begging her to try and eat something so that he would take her down. But the girls, they couldn't really get much sense out of her. Gary left Sandra hung up like that for 2 days.
Jeez.
Her health rapidly declining to the point that Josefina was calling out to her, trying to get her to open her eyes and talk to them. Sandra, hanging by her one wrist, the full weight of her body slumped forward, was unable to respond. When Gary eventually came down to release Sandra, he shouted at her to stand up, taking her silence as a refusal to comply. He decided she would have to stand up straight if he released her handcuff, otherwise she would fall over. So that's what Gary did. He reached up and released Sandra's arm from the rafters above her. Like a dead weight, she fell face forward onto the hard concrete floor, eyes staring at the other 4 women as they watched in horror. Sandra was dead.
Yeah, no.
Gary walked over to Sandra, picked her up, and slung her over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. "Oh well, that's a waste of a baby," he said, as he carried her out of the basement and up the stairs. The women huddled together, unable to shed a tear for their fallen comrade. Her death hit Josefina the hardest. She'd known Sandra the longest and had gotten very protective of her. But worst of all, Gary had known Sandra the longest. They had been friends. He'd taken her out for food regularly. If he could act so callously towards her death, what hope did the rest of them have? Josefina was now no longer sure of her plan. How could she win over a man who could kill someone in such a manner and not even bat an eyelid? How on earth was she going to escape this horrendous basement? And that's the end of part 1.
Oh, fucking hell. I was just thinking, yeah, how? She'll tell me in a minute.
You have to tune in.
I'll be there.
Yep. It's such a long, in-depth story that there's no way I could put it into one part.
I think these are the stories that freak me out the most.
Yeah.
It's that not knowing, like you're being held prisoner by some sort of psychopath. And you just don't know. And then when they do something like that, like poor Sandra,
yeah,
they'd actually been friends for like a few years. And he's just like, oh, that's annoying.
Yeah. That's exactly it. And Josefina
Jeez.
thought he's got a human side, so I'm going to appeal to that.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden she thinks he's absolutely not got a human side.
Yeah.
Where does that leave me?
Yeah. 100% monster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you win over a monster that doesn't feel for other people?
God, that's hideous.
Yeah.
I can picture it all though. I mean, as horrible and horrendous as it is, I was right there with them, standing in the basement,
Yeah.
like observing it and realizing like how cold they must have been just in t-shirts, and how
Yeah.
dirty and how smelly it must have been down there, and how terrifying every time they heard a noise or someone coming back in. I mean, to be honest, at this point, I don't know how I would react if I was in that situation. Of course, I don't. But my guess would be that I would just be like, let's just kill him and then we'll worry about getting out the chains after.
Well, this is the reason that I've chosen this episode, because as you will see in episode 2, there's a massive contrast between the women, and as I said at the beginning, it's a story of what a person will do, to what lengths they will go to in order to save themselves. And it's very, very interesting. And it will create a discussion, which I'm very interested to hear.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the reason I chose this story mainly, is just because of it's unbelievable someone's will to survive and what they're willing to do, and things like that. And then I won't go too much into it, but it's there's so much more in the second episode than there is in the first.
Okay. I'll look forward to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. All right. Well,
see you for part 2.
You go and recover from that. Yeah. I'll
Yeah,
see
well,
you.
I need to finish writing part 2, so that's what I'll be doing.
Cool.
So yeah.
All right.
See you on the next one.
See you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm going to get a drink quickly and put these
Right.
fucking olives in the bin.
Put it in an envelope and send them to me.